I feel like I can speak for most of us when I say we've all played bad games at some point in our life.
Welcome back, Captain Obvious.
Yes, I am!
And when a game gets super bad, the world likes to clown on it, toss it into the shadow realm of mediocrity and forget that it ever existed. But not Japan. In Japan, they like to memorialize all of the worst games that have come out every year in what is known as the Kusogame of the Year Awards, which has been going on every year since the year 2004. In this ranking, the worst of the worst games made by corporations are ranked by the underbelly of the Japanese internet. You can think of it as a hall of shame for the worst games that these companies have made across the years. And yes, I am specifying companies because the people who made this ranking, they are true connoisseurs of the field. They understand that these games have a higher level of, you could say, responsibility, I guess, since they are designed by companies who ought to know better. We're all not here to make fun of little Timmy and his first game. This is all meant to show people or to, memorialize the worst games that the people who should be good at their job have made that were completely horrible. So against my own better judgment, I've decided to endeavour to try to play as many of the games on this list as I can and see if they truly are as bad as people have said. So here we are, back once again.
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
So the game I would like to share with you guys today is the worst game of 2009. Not 2008, because I need to figure out the logistics of that before I can do that, even though it will make more sense chronologically. But the best... Oh my god, there's something wrong with me, isn't there? But the worst game of 2009 has some very interesting things about it that make it very unique from the rest of the entries across the years. And that's the reason why I decided that, if we can't do 2008's worst game, we might as well just do 2009's. For starters, this is the only game on the entire ranking till now where a specific port of the game is considered to be the worst game of the year. And mind you, this is in spite of the fact that all ports of the game came out in the same year, and that this ranking actually compares games of all platforms against each other, so it's not like each platform gets its own competition and hence why this happened. So it might sound a little odd, right? If a game is bad, it doesn't matter what consoles you put it on, it'll be bad either way. I mean, you could even put it on the Soldier Boy console, and due to the fact that it's the only game that releases, it'll be both the best and worst game at the same time. If it's bad, it's gonna be bad. And yet, for this game, it ended up with the case that, in spite of the fact that the PC version released in 2008, that wasn't considered for this ranking at all. It was just considered to be a very mediocre game. And in 2009, it released on the same day to both the PSP and the PS2, but specifically the PS2 version is only the one being considered for this list. Secondly, this is the only game on the entire list where an adult game has been put onto the ranking as well. I mean, since it's a PS2 port, it's no longer really an adult-only game due to the fact that most of the very suspicious content has been removed and therefore it's an all ages game now. But even then, due to the fact that most of those adult games in Japan, like your visual novel-ish games, doesn't matter whether or not they have any other side genres like a strategy game or action game or whatever to them, most of the time it comes from games like that, the people tend to look at it more leniently in terms of the lack of gameplay or problems with gameplay and so on and so forth, because that, while it helps to elevate the game to better heights, it does not make the game. It's not what people typically focus on, and therefore people don't look at it as hard when it comes to games like this, and therefore you don't really see games like this on this list, even though there are many of them that are not very good either. Yet in spite of the fact that games like these are typically very leniently looked on, this game actually made the list, and it's because of this reason, as well as the first reason that I mentioned, that this game happened to be a very unique choice on this list. And the game that I'm speaking of is I think like the last time I'm gonna have to put the actual game's like cover art here as well, but so Sengokuhime, as the game is called, except that the Goku is not the country Goku, but Kyoku as in like extreme. So this is like war extreme princess instead of warring states princess. Bit of a wordplay, very clever there. But for this game, it was initially released on the PC in 2008, and back then it was an adult visual novel strategy adventure game. It's a bit of a mouthful and it's a bit confusing what you would actually classify it genre-wise, but it was a lot of things at once, and hence why such a long genre. So in the game, you would have strategy sections where you conquer nations, fight against them, build an army, build up your economy, and adventure segments where you get to know the girls, go out talking and playing with them, and in the end maybe do some things that can't be said on YouTube, But suffice to say that when it came to the PC version of this game, while all of that was there when this was ported to the PS2 and the PSP, a lot of that content couldn't be put onto those consoles, and as a result, you kind of had a game where some of this adult content was removed. And in place of all of that, they supposedly replaced a large part of the content with more family-friendly character arc segments. So when it came to the PS2 and PSP versions of the game, it is likelier to be classified as a strategy adventure game. But as to how those adventure segments ended up, we'll talk more about that later on. Right now, as it stands, how good of a game is this though? I'm sorry, this game like messes with me a bit, so it's like I can't really think too straight when this game is on screen. But when it comes to this game, all I can really say is that this game, it really feels a lot to me at least like the eldritch horror of a buggy game, because it really slowly creeps into your psyche and causes you to go insane and start to question whether everything in the game is truly an insane bug or something at some point as you get into it. Like when you first start off the game, it's very benign, I would say, but as you progresses more into it, more weird stuff starts to happen bit by bit, subtly until the point where it's not so subtle anymore. And at some point in the game, you start to question whether everything you've seen in the past up to this point is also a bug that you just never realized was a bug instead of a feature. And to that end, like, just to make sure that I really was looking at the game itself and not a bug, right, like in terms of systems and features, I actually bought 3 copies of the game just to make sure that like what I was seeing was actually meant to be in the game and not a bug between individual versions. Because what happened was that this game was considered to be so buggy at the time that it was nigh unclearable, and the company that made the game stealthily released a fixed version of the game which they did not announce, and you had to send back your copy of the game to get it replaced. So many copies of the game out there are still the old buggy copy, but some aren't because most people wouldn't have realized since it wasn't ever notified. And so I bought multiple copies just to make sure I wasn't going insane. And on top of these 3 copies, I even bought the PC version of the game, because the PC version is supposed to be the game that's closest to being their original design intent. So by buying all of this, I was trying to make sure that what I was looking at wasn't a bug and was actually what's meant to be the game. And if you think that I'm being crazy for buying multiple copies of this game, you are crazy, okay? No, this is all fine. This was just to be more professional with all of this. To put it very, very simply, this game on the PS2 was rated as a very, very, very buggy mess with very, very boring systems as well, because some of the things that made the game interesting were no longer in the game, and because of all the bugs that were in it, it kind of pushed the game towards the point where even if you could clear it in spite of all the bugs, which very few people actually managed to without excessive save scumming, you would have a very boring time because there isn't too much as a result of a very poor job porting the game. Supposedly, even though the PSP and PS2 versions released at the same time, you actually get more content in the PSP version, like on like Japanese commentary, like on the website itself for this game's rating. It actually states it as, you have the PS2 version, you have an insurmountable wall, and then you have the PSP version like way up there. That's how big the difference between the two is. So I've been trying to think of how best to present my points when it comes to this game, due to the fact that I can't really go chronologically from start to end like we did the last video, due to the fact that with this game, there is a lot of different issues with it that crisscross across the timeline, and due to the fact that there's multiple factions with multiple stories that all start at the same point and end chronologically around whatever time the game is meant to end at, we don't really have a good way to do this chronologically, because there's no point in me talking about every single one of these faction stories. There's a lot of, well, not exactly overlap, but there isn't a lot of important things to talk about. So what I'm thinking of doing is to talk about the important points I find of this game, the good, the bad, and the buggy. And then once that's all done, we will talk about all the remaining bugs that I can't classify anywhere else, because there's a lot of those, more so than anything else to talk about. And as a point of comparison, I figured we could pick another adult strategy adventure game that was released around that same era. And since this is the version of the game where there is no lewd content, like all the not safe for work stuff has been mostly removed, we could pick another game from the era that kind of had the same thing going on. And so the game I'm planning to use is Sengoku Runs. You're actually going to use that game. Like I know that this game is probably a very contentious one to use, but it's the closest thing we actually can come to when it comes to a game that's similar in most facets other than, well, certain gameplay elements. And so this game might be the best one to use. Plus, on top of that, I just realized that Manga Gamers actually made a stream safe version patch of this game, so you can actually play this game on stream mostly safely, with most of the content that is a bit problematic already omitted from it. So as a result, we do have a pretty close comparison in terms of a game that also had that. If we were to play that game with its content removed and play, I can't even vote. Like, can they not do this every other day nowadays? So yeah, as weird as it is, we will be using Sengoku Runs when necessary as a point of comparison due to the fact that while these two games might be quite different ideology-wise in terms of the design, it is the closest thing to an adult strategy RPG adventure game that would make for a good point of comparison, because Sengoku Runs released in I think 2006 and this game comes out in 2008. So they came out in a rather similar time frame, with Sengoku Runs having come out earlier than that, so it would work for as a good point of comparison. I feel like the only other game I can think of is Nobunaga's Ambition, but that game is a way higher budget game made by a company with both a lot more money and a lot more people working for it, so I felt like it wouldn't be as fair of a comparison, especially since that game was developed first as a strategy game rather than as an adult adventure thing as well. So the points that they focus on would be slightly more different, and therefore I feel like rather than using a proper strategy game, we should be using something with as close of a comparison point as possible. So I went to well, I mean, this is just for show, but I bought the English version, which has the streamer patch, so we can play it without any of the content, and it was actually pretty fun, not gonna lie. Like, I really do feel like it was a way better game even without any of that content. For people who thought it would have been impossible to play that game while skipping all of that content, it actually works. Like, if they did a little more like fine-tuning on the stream safe version, it would actually work very well, I feel like. A quick disclaimer before I go into talking more about the game itself. I do apologize that this is taking so long, but I just want to get this out of the way as early as possible. But I'm not out here to witch hunt the entire series. I actually did play quite a few of the later games in the series. Like, the first game in the series I played, I think, was the 5th game on the PlayStation Vita. I even bought the limited edition version, even though I didn't know what the series was about at the time. And I played the 6th and 7th game after, as well as went back to play the 4th game after all of that. Very enjoyable. A lot better than what this first game was. So for me, like, seeing this first game as well is quite an interesting thing, because I can really see how big the gap is. So I'm not here to make fun of the whole series. If you do like the series, more power to you. I do as well. It's just that it was a common consensus that it was a very bad version of the game. I mean, we're not even saying that the whole game is bad, just the PlayStation 2 version. The second thing is that I have played through this version of the game, I think, like 7 times from start to end. I think it's about 40 plus hours per playthrough. And some of them playthroughs are actually way longer than that. I'll explain why in a bit, how they drag quite a bit. And on top of that, if you count all the runs where I stopped halfway because I realized I was kind of screwed, I actually played through this more than 25 times, I think. So I did give this game a very fair shot. I played it once on each of the copies of the game I purchased, and on top of that, I played another 3 times to check out the other factions as well. So believe me when I say I give this game a fair shot, and this is all my opinion of the game after having played through it this many times. So more importantly, let's go to the game itself. How good is Sengokuhime, and what were the issues that it faced? So the first issue I'm going to talk about is the problem with what I call the user friendliness of the game. Some might call it UX, user experience, and that's pretty much what this is. And the reason I say this is due to the fact that the game does not do a very good job of getting the players to understand what they are supposed to do. And this is an issue that lasts throughout the entire game, and it can lead to quite a lot of frustration on the end of the player as well, because it is very hard to pass aside what is a bug and what is a feature unless you played the game on multiple consoles. So the first big issue with this is the fact that when you start the game, you kind of do have a tutorial button, but the tutorial button really does not teach you how to play the game. It just tells you what factions there are and gives you some early guides on what you could do as the faction, but nothing specific either. Like for Uesugi, for example, the game kind of tells you that yeah, you want to face off against your biggest enemy Takeda after you build up your faction. And that there's a second slide there that says, yeah, or you could also ally with them, but maybe, and stuff like this. But the entire tutorial is just this for every single faction. And then that's it. They don't really tell you how to play the game. And when you start a new game, well, once you have selected your faction, you just get a cutscene. And once the cutscene is done, you just push straight into the game. They don't even have something as simple as a quick tutorial where someone like as an assistant like explains to you, yeah, you want to do this at the start. And this is what each of these buttons do. And the thing is that the text on each of the buttons, most of them aren't very obvious either. Like, it's not a case of like, yeah, if you can read Japanese, you're definitely going to understand what they do. Far from it, it's kind of hard to tell what they would do once you click the button. And even when you use the buttons, they affect stats and numbers that you wouldn't really know the effects of at the start of the game, because those aren't things that are very obvious either. For example, during one of your phases, you kind of have this button over here at the top right, which is used to indirectly increase your nation's income. And the way it does it is that it increases a stat first called the Kokudaka, which is an ancient Edo system of taxation used based off the land and the amount of land yield your nation has, which the daimyo uses to figure out how much to charge each of the ruling clans, so on and so forth. And it's the kind of thing where if you don't really know what any of this means, it's a little difficult to understand at the start. And what you'll find out later on is that the higher this stat is, the more units you can recruit from the city, and the higher your income would be. But these are not things that are told to you by the game. You would have to figure them out all on your own, which I find this sort of lack of explanation, which lasts throughout the game, to be very problematic. Because this is the same for the battle system as well, wherein you have multiple buttons where each button does a different thing, but you're not really told what each of these buttons do. So you kind of have to figure out through experimentation what each of our attacks do without knowing exactly how it will work. Those of you who play a lot of games from the era, you might have noticed something that I have not mentioned yet, which is that, wait a minute, if this is a game, a very old game from that era, shouldn't there be a manual that comes with it that explains everything? Because like a lot of older games in particular used to have very detailed and thick manuals. In those manuals, you would typically have a lot of the game explained to you. I think the first game I ever played that did not have one of those was Call of Duty. I think it had only like a 3-page manual explaining like system settings and the like, but before that, most games used to have it, and I used to enjoy reading those a lot, because like on the way home after buying the game, you can just read it and be like, oh yeah, this is cool, this is what the game has and all that. And indeed, this game does have one. Only for the PS2 version. The PC version does not have one, which is kind of weird, since that means that in the initial game, you don't, even despite the fact that you don't get the tutorial, the game doesn't explain things to you all too well either, but you have one. It's 37 pages long, and it's not very simple either. It's a lot of text. Which, until you finally start up the game and play it, it's very hard to understand what each of these things mean. Because, like, for example, over here, you have all these explanations over here of everything, all the different numbers which are over here and here, but you wouldn't know what any of these actually mean. All the information is in this booklet, meaning if you did not read this booklet, you would not get another explanation of any of the tutorials or like any of how to play the game at all. And some people might argue like, yeah, just read, you know how to play the game, you read. But I know this might just be a personal opinion, but I feel like a game should try to teach the players how to play the game in the most natural way possible. That is to say, you would want it to be in the game, and you want to incentivize the players to use the systems, and therefore they will understand best how each of the systems work. Like, this booklet doesn't actually explain some of the important mechanics to you as well. Kind of like how if you equip rifles to a unit, it's only efficient up to 30%. So for example, if you had a unit with 3 men, you could give rifles technically to all 3 of them, but only one of them would actually use the rifle. So only one person's stat will be used for the damage calculation. Meanwhile, because all 3 of them have a rifle, all 3 of them are nerfed in melee instead of just one. So you're actually putting yourself at a massive disadvantage for doing that. But the game does not explain this to you, and therefore you end up putting yourselves in disadvantages because the game does not do it. Also, that perfectly segues into the first bug in the game. And this one is actually a kind of funny one, because this is probably the only bug in the game that is actually officially stated to be an intentional feature of the game, which is that if you equip a unit with more guns than there are people in the unit actually turns into a super destruction robot, kind of like the super death laser robot at the end of the research tier in Civilization, where they essentially get the power to do this. Well, you know the old saying, right? Give a man a gun and he'll shoot his enemies for a day. Give a man 2 guns and he becomes a nuclear weapon that can destroy the entire nation. Am I right? No? It's not how guns work. But yeah, very bad joke aside, this was actually the only bug in the game that was officially recognized, and according to them, it's meant to be homaged from another one of their games, made like even way further back in the past. I think you have to be an actual boomer to know this one, because I have never seen it before either. Though frankly, I would rather, instead of adding in older bugs as a homage, that they actually had done something about all the bugs in this game instead. But I guess that's too much to ask for, huh? In that other game, if you gave more guns than men in a unit, it would cause some kind of stack overflow, which like multiplied the damage by factors of what it was meant to be, and so they ended up doing a super amount of damage, and that's how they got the idea to do this. Kind of like a cheat code, I guess you could say, before the idea of inputting 50 buttons in some kind of sick combo like the exercise in carpal tunnel syndrome they had in GTA 2. And then there's also the fact that information in this booklet is not very well laid out. Like information on where your stats would affect your income is actually written on this page over here, but then you're only told how to increase the thing that indirectly affects your income all the way on this page back here. So it's like there's about a 5-page difference between the two, and you're told about the stat before you're told what it does. So like stuff like this is not very well explained. I feel like what this game should have done is that information in here should have been in the tutorial in the game instead. And the information in the tutorial, which is flavor text, should have been in here instead. Like, they did the reverse, I feel like. Because that is the kind of information that I would have loved to have read on the way back home from the manual, and I would have loved for the game to actually tell me what to do properly and in a actual tidy order within the game in the most natural way possible. That is also the fact that the in-game tutorial, the thing that tells you what you could do with this faction, is kind of providing you with misinformation as well. Like the one for Uesugi that I mentioned, they tell you in the end that you could ally with Takeda, but what they didn't tell you is that you could do that, but you don't get rewarded with some kind of unique if history where if the two factions allied, because for those of you who do not know Japanese history, the two were like big rivals at the time, and you do not get any benefit for allying. Far from it, you actually like lock yourself up from clearing the game, because beating Takeda in battle is actually one of the things that would allow you as Uesugi to clear the game. So by not doing it, you effectively can't win. And that is something the game doesn't tell you. Aside from the fact that the game doesn't even tell you how to complete the game, but we'll get to that near the end of the video. So that's all I have to say about my first impressions of the game that I had at the time, the issues with the general UX as well as the way they deal with the tutorial and how they try to ease new players into the game and all of that. Now, let's get into the part of the video you guys are probably more interested in, which are the bugs that exist in the individual segments of the game that began our slow descent into the world of the eldritch horror that is the creeping madness of the bugs in this game, as well as my thoughts on what made these segments a little less entertaining than they probably should have been. Firstly, for some reason I don't know why, and this is the first bug I noticed as well, was the fact that if you were to push the auto button during any of the conversations, somehow all the voice acting gets muted out of the game. I don't know why it does that. And then at the end of certain cutscenes, the game just skips your first phase of the turn. Like, there's no mention that this is supposed to happen. After playing the PC version, I realized that this is not a thing that's meant to happen. So apparently there's this weird bug that causes your first part of the turn to skip, which can be very problematic on certain turns, because the first phase is when you actually recruit units and purchase more weapons. So not being able to do that is huge. You can also only pay your generals more to increase their loyalty during this turn. So if you have someone who's about to defect, if this turn suddenly gets skipped like this, you're going to have a very big issue. And not only that, it seems like there are also times where it actually does just skip a turn even though there isn't a cutscene. However, during the turns that it does, there is this strange interaction that happens here where the screen fades to black, it loads for quite a while, and then it just goes back into the game without anything really changing, and your turn has already been skipped. I suspect this might have to do with the fact that cutscenes periodically get skipped. So what is happening is that a cutscene was meant to play, it got skipped, but the game still reads it as kinda playing, and therefore your turn still gets skipped as a result. Very rarely, if at all, do I get skips where it's just end of the turn unless a strange interaction like this happens. And then it's the fact that for some reason troop hiring costs double gold. Like in the game itself, it kind of says there that it costs 1 gold to hire 1 troop, but for some reason when you actually try to hire troops, it consumes 2 gold instead of 1, and the game does not make any mention to it at all. Then you have the fact that when you're recruiting units, for some reason your happiness, the amount that it reduces by, is not as stable as it should be. Like this is not an issue in the PC version. When you recruit a unit, your happiness goes down by a fixed amount. But for some reason in the PS2 version, it can actually vary by a huge amount. So at times it can reduce by less than the number of units you hire, and sometimes you can just hire 5 units and it goes to 0 faster than most NFTs would on being launched. So the reason for this is due to a very weird way that the game actually calculates the happiness of the population when you recruit a unit as a factor of the scale of the city. Remember the stat I mentioned before of the Japanese and no one uses anymore? Turns out, and this is something the game never mentions to you, that stat actually affects how much the population's happiness drops when you recruit as well. The issue is, what it does is it takes that number to the nearest thousandth, which this number is to the nearest 10,000 because of the way the units of measurements work in Japanese. This is 10,000, this is 1,000. So the thing is that as a result, the game shows you this bigger number, but it actually uses this number instead. So I may not be the smartest bush on the tree, but what did I just say? Whatever. Anyway, I may not be the smartest person around, but as a fellow scientist myself, I figured I must as well just try my best to explain what is causing this bug, because what is causing this is a little bit of a complicated one, but it is one of the few cases where the cause is actually known. So the first issue, well, the way the game stores the values rather, is that it is storing all of this stats and values as a little endian hexadecimal, and what this means is that it's storing the least significant byte at the smallest address. What that actually means, you don't need to know, it's very complicated to explain, but you can think of it as if you have this integer here, this number, essentially what it is doing is that it is storing it in the SpongeBob equivalent of opposite day, where it stores the back at the front and the front at the back, and then it just goes down that order instead. And what is happening is that the game is taking this value, the 200, for example, in this case, let's say we take 260,000 as the value of that stat. What the game is doing is first dividing this by 1,000 and then taking this number and turning it into a hexadecimal. And since this is a little endian hexadecimal, what the game does is take this 260,000 and convert it into 0401 and stores it as that number. The problem is that the game's code is somehow reading this 0401 as meaning that the number in the ones position is 4, and therefore it reads your 260,000 in the stat as just 4,000 in the stat. Well, yes, I am something of a scientist myself. A scientist of death! And therefore, because the unit size that you're recruiting is way bigger than the city can support, it just wipes out your entire city's happiness faster than any NFT would have died under Jake Paul. And this one actually affects a lot, because if the happiness drops too low, you get more revolts, and more revolts results in even bigger issues for you due to the fact that revolts in this game are very annoying to deal with and are already very frequent at high happiness. So the more your happiness drops, the more your city's recruitment gets affected, your city scale starts to decrease, and the riots will force everything to decrease even more, so it forces a downward spiral which you are going to want to avoid, and the only way you can avoid this is simply by not recruiting. So yeah, you're kind of put in a situation where you're kind of screwed. It's either you stop recruiting until you upgrade the city to a significant scale where it's no longer an issue, or you just bite the bullet and take the happiness loss, which is, yeah, I don't think that's how good games are meant to be played, but that was one of the very big issues with the strategy phase. So the way revolts work in this game is that the rebels would suddenly pop up in one random castle of yours and take it over, and then they would start to begin aggressively attacking other castles in the area, which means that if you don't consistently upgrade the defenses of all of your castles, the rather large rebel unit can actually consistently conquer castle after castle in a chain, so unless you have enough units to defend every castle around them before attacking them, it's gonna be very difficult unless you spend money to upgrade all of your castles, and high level castles all cost maintenance, which reduces your income as well, so in the end, if you're trying to defend against them, it's very problematic and it will slow down the game a lot as well, which is one of the reasons why the game gets quite draggy, because in order to defend successfully against revolts that spontaneously happen, you kind of need to upgrade every single castle which takes actions, reduces your income, which means lesser men, and therefore means that you can't compete with the enemies as aggressively, especially when you're fighting multiple fronts. And so you have to slow down, play the diplomatic game and all that, which makes the game feel very strategic like it's meant to be, but the fact that it's due to a bug that you're playing more strategically feels very off as well. And I can't believe I have to say this, but then again you also have some other more benign bugs as well. The fact that the music seems to overlap at some point depending on how the phases change. The fact that the map is wrong at certain points in terms of the layout, so like every village and castle is supposed to have lines connecting them, but some of the lines are off. And on top of that, you also have something where when you're trying to upgrade the city, sometimes instead of the skill value going up, it just goes down instead. I don't know how that happens. The game doesn't give you any feedback to tell you that something failed that caused that. So all of this just adds on to the fact that it means that during that point, you can't upgrade that area. Most of these upgrades for cities are based on a region. So when you see that number go down, it means that quite likely most regions are just gonna fail as well for some reason, and the game never explains why, which I can't tell if it's actually a bug or just poor UX not telling you you failed, even though it didn't happen till very late in the game and I couldn't get it to replicate on the PC version, so I guess I have to chalk that one up to a bug as well. Then one very off thing as well is the fact that if you have no generals in a region, you can't even inspect the region unless you zoom into it, and zooming in is kind of slow, like there's a slight load time and all that. So you can't at a glance look at the region and tell how it's doing unless you have a general there, which I guess kind of makes sense if you want to make it as a more strategic game, but it also makes it very problematic when you're trying to monitor whether or not there are rebels in the area, because unless they happen to be in a specific position that would cause the region on the map to change color, you wouldn't be able to tell which regions are, well, rebelling at a glance unless you sat there and stared at all the text all the time and paid attention to the notifications, which you should be doing. It's just that playing this game over and over burnt me out to the point that I stopped paying attention to that at some point, and so this was something I realized as a result of that. And there's also another very strange one where, okay, so one thing I forgot to mention to this point is that in each castle you can have a max of 6 generals, so once you have reached 6 generals you can't move more generals in. And if you try to attack a castle, you can't attack a castle with more than 6 generals. But sometimes the game will actually allow you to poach generals, even though you have 6 generals in a castle. And so the thing with poaching is that when you poach a general, they'll enter the same castle as everyone else who's already in that castle. So when you have more than 6 generals in a castle, what happens is that, so when you have the 6 and you poach a guy, you have the 7th and 8th and 9th and so on if you poach more than one person. Everyone who you poach, the new people who are in the 7th to 9th position, all of them just become unusable. They literally just go into some kind of catatonic state where they still exist, you can still look at them, and you can move their lifeless corpse around, but they cannot participate in anything at all. Literally, it reaches the point where it feels like you just smack them over the head with a hammer or something and just put them into a brain-dead vegetative state completely instead of poaching them. I guess that means you kind of did poach them, huh? Just kind of in a different way instead. But yeah, that's a little bit of a weird thing. It's like once you know it's a thing, you can kind of avoid doing that, but it's a little annoying that the game, because of the fact that it's bugging multiple ways, it one, allows you to do that, and then two, once it allows you to do that, it kind of just like bugs out all the generals that you added in. And there was one other bug, and this one was actually quite big and actually is one of the biggest ones in the strategy phase, I feel like, other than the ones that I couldn't replicate, which I'll also go into after this. And that will be the one where, for some reason, when you... Okay, I need to figure out how to explain this right, because this one's a bit problematic. Okay, so picture this. You have your castle, and the enemy has their castle, right? So, what typically happens if you attack them and they attack you at the same time is that if their attack comes first, he would attack your castle and your attack gets negated. So you don't attack, even if you win the defensive battle, your army does not then attack him after that. However, for some weird reason, the game has a probability to bug in a way that when it's your turn, this behaves as normal, but if you attack first and they attack after, instead of you attacking and successfully preventing their attack, after your attack is complete, they will still attack you. And the thing is that in spite of the fact that if you win the battle, they would get pushed to a separate castle. So let's say like further out of my screen, there's a castle there somewhere. If you attack him and you win this battle, his generals would normally retreat to that castle over there. But what happens is that instead of this, his generals who are in this castle can choose to retreat from the siege. And where in a normal case they would retreat back, they would instead somehow attack your castle as well. So the thing is that once you take the castle, they can then take the castle behind you, and thereby you are both now stuck in a situation where you are both surrounded on both sides by castles of the opposing faction, which is very awkward, as you can imagine, because I think I didn't mention this before, but if a general is in a castle with no escape route and they get attacked and the enemy wins the siege, all generals in the faction in that castle will either die or surrender, where main generals who are key to the faction will all die and everyone who isn't has a chance to die or surrender and go to the other faction. So it puts you at very high risk for multiple reasons. First, it makes your general and that army that attack very vulnerable to being attacked from both sides and then dying. And it also means that if your castle behind that castle of yours that was there gets attacked, you can't defend it very well either. Because if you don't have an army already there, he can then just keep pushing on and on that way and just keep taking your castles with his main army. Oh, and the thing is, this can happen in multiple different cases as well. It's not necessarily just a case of if you attack into each other's castles like this. It can also happen if like there's three castles like A, B, and C, where A and B are yours and C is his. If you attack him and he attacks the other castle at the bottom, the same thing can happen as well. So as a result, you are stuck in a situation where you need to ensure that in spite of the fact your castle can only fit 6 units, you need to leave some on the defense while also using some on the attack. It's either that or you need to find a way to flank castles, but you can't do that at choke points as well, which makes it very problematic because you either need to beat them in a war of attrition to the point that they can't attack you and then you attack them back and quickly take the land before they can choose to attack you as well, or you just keep waiting or find ways to hit other places instead, which, as you can imagine, really slows down the game a lot. The other way you can do it is to just build up your castle instead. So you build up the castle's defense and you leave the bare minimum number of units to defend, and then you attack with the bare minimum and hope you win. And if you do that, you can technically win and prevent his counterattack from succeeding. In which case, he doesn't die, he just vanishes. Like, it's very weird what happens with the army at that point, because I had a case where when that happened, they retreated back to the castle just after that, and I had cases where they just vanished from the map completely, which is very weird. They don't count as dead, I think, but they don't exist anymore either. It's like they just get snapped into oblivion or something by a funny purple man. I really don't know what happens to them. Some say they could have been sent to the Shadow Realm by Jimmy Neutron's father, but even till this day, we still have no way of knowing. Though yeah, I guess that's one of the biggest ones that can happen to the player that I suffered from at least. There are a whole lot more other than that as well that are pretty big and that I could not replicate even across 7 playthroughs due to the fact that they are more chance-based. In order to preserve my own sanity, I'll just report on them as is, and you guys can, well, take it with a pinch of salt, I suppose. There's also the issue of what are called black hole castles, which can occur for a number of reasons, and as the name implies, once something goes in, it will never come out. And what we mean with this is that once generals are sent in, they become completely unusable, even on defense of the castle that they're in itself. And this can happen in a number of ways. The biggest one is that some of them experienced it when a general suddenly appeared in one of their castles. That is to say, a general that they did not recruit suddenly appeared in one of their castles, and then everyone in that castle essentially got sucked into the void, along with that sudden void spawn that just occurred in the castle. I know, actually eldritch shit happening here, where people are just getting dragged into oblivion out of nowhere. Another is the literal return of the dead. Apparently generals who had died, so when you wipe out a faction, the leaders of the faction will not join you, but most of the time they would just die instead. What could happen is that these factions would suddenly re-rise and rebel, taking up a castle again, and begin attacking areas nearby. But if you attack and take the castle back from them, you will also get stuck in a black hole. Like, it's actual return of the dead, you getting pulled into the void when you try to deal with the dead sort of stuff happening. So it's like a lot of it is actually really insane as well. And then while we're on the topic of undead generals, there's also the possibility for generals under you that die to end up spawning in an enemy army later on, fighting back against you, as well as armies that appear out of nowhere with no connection to a castle, suddenly somehow being able to attack it. And more often than not, the armies just end up killing themselves instead. So yeah, you also end up with shadow armies that are just there to cause horror and terror, attacking out of nowhere and disappearing once they've caused enough fear and shock. And this is what I mean when I say that bit by bit, the game really does slowly start to get more and more insane as all sorts of weird stuff tends to happen once you get later into the game, as all of this actually start to have more chances to actually trigger. Though that said, I think this is most of the bugs that are detailed by others when it comes to specifically the strategy segment. We go into the battle as well as the adventure segments of the game after this, but as for my general opinion on, well, outside of all the bugs, this segment of the game itself, I would say that it's very unorderly and it's not done in a way that is very user-friendly as well. And what I mean by this is there are a lot of actions that you can take which are not built to be very optimal in terms of the controls themselves. So what do you think is going to happen here, right? Okay, so just to show you that my keyboard works as intended, right? I'm going to move it up, down, left. This is left, this is right. It's reversed for you because of how the world works with mirrors and shit, I think. So up, down, left, right, it all works, right? The more I push right, the more right it goes. The more I push left, the more it goes left. Now what do you think happens if I go into the map and I push right? Do you think it's gonna end up like somewhere at the bottom? Or do you think it's gonna end up, nope, it's going to the left? So if I push right again, what do you think is gonna happen again? Is it gonna go left again to the one that's below it? No, it jumps to the left. What if I push right again? It goes back left? Whoa! So what if I go all the way back here and I push left there? That actually works. And then it jumps all the way here after like 3 movements. Like, the whole thing is really quite a mess. There's also the fact that if you wanted to shift an army from, let's say, one end of Japan to the other, the process is instant. They still do teleport with, well, eldritch magic and all, but the process of you sending them there requires you to navigate the entire map through all the castles, through all the different paths, and then selecting the castle on the other end. So if midway through you realize you forgot to do something and you need to reset the whole process, well, good luck. That means you're going to spend another few minutes slowly navigating every single region along the way, which means that you're going to have to remember which path leads where as well. Otherwise you're going to spend a lot of time wasted just navigating to send one army to the other end of Japan. What I'd have to say is that the game does not do a good job of making it very accessible. And I guess in a sense you can kind of argue that this system forces you to be more strategic even then, since you're forced to put generals in specific castles and then order them to attack or defend from there. But I feel like these are systems that should have been improved. As in, when you compare it to Sengoku runs, obviously in that game you don't have to position generals to guard each individual castle. Rather, you have a pool. When you get attacked or you attack, you pick from the pool and you just take an action. When it comes to taking an action as well, you can kind of see very easily from a window, like, well, what can you do in each of these cities, which is something that you can't really tell with Sengokuhime for some reason. Like, sometimes in certain cities you can't improve the scale, sometimes you can't improve morale, but looking at the region you can't really tell, and the only way you can tell is to push the menu button, which there's a slow load time. Then once you enter the menu, you have to exit the menu and do this for every single region instead. So when you reach the later parts of the game where you have 15, 20, 30 regions, it gets very slow if you want to make sure that you're checking each region to see what you can do in terms of recruiting units, upgrading buildings, sabotaging enemy castles, upgrading castles, and all of this. Whereas it runs, by virtue of the fact you have that at a glance window, you can see everything there. it makes decision making a lot quicker, and that is something I would say that it does a lot better. Diplomacy also does exist in the game, and it's a very simplistic feature where you just push a button, send a general to ask for diplomacy, and then the generals on the enemy side just decide yes, no, yes, you have peace, no, you don't have peace. There is no bargaining or trying to find ways to get them to agree to certain policies and all that. It's just yes, no to peace and alliance, and it's just a random number whether or not they will do it or not. But if you manage to succeed, you could essentially reduce the number of enemies on your borders and just steamroll the small number of enemies there are. And due to the fact that your troops per general are kept at 50, it means that by mid-game, more often than not, you and a couple of very big factions will all have multiple generals at cap, so it just becomes an attrition punching fest of who can slug the other guy down quicker in a war of attrition. This is basically like what they say in Mount and Blade, the first game, when you ask them like, hey, what is war like? And they just tell you that, oh yeah, war is a battle of attrition where two factions just punch each other until someone runs out of steam and then they settle on a white peace with certain policies or borders redrawn. This is basically that, except even more boring, because at least with Mount and Blade, you actually get to play very dramatic battles and you can actually maneuver around the map trying to flank and outflank enemies in a way where you can still try to outnumber them in battle. Whereas in this game, not only are you probably going to enter most battles outnumbered instead because of the fact that the game is bugged, but even if you have more generals than them, if they have enough generals to stock every single castle on the front line, you are fixed to only being able to fight them with an equal number of generals more often than not, since even if you have two paths to a castle like I mentioned before, you can only attack them with 6 generals, so you will always have the same number of people fighting them as they have on their side. So it gets kind of boring because you don't really have any incentive to build up big armies. There isn't too much you can do in terms of maneuverability to try and outsmart the enemy through clever movements, things like outflanking them and attacking their supply lines, therefore starving them out to force them to either surrender or retreat, which you do find in other games nowadays like Unity of Command 2 and Romance of the Three Kingdoms 14, and I find being able to use tactics like this quite interesting, especially when you consider the fact that in Asia, this kind of tactics were already in practice close to 0 AD during the Romance of the Three Kingdoms era in China, which is actually referenced quite a few times within this game as well, so it's kind of unfortunate that none of those interesting strategies were actually put into play in a way that could be taken advantage of in this game. And there's also the fact that you can't do the standard rule of thumb and bring 3 times the number of men as there are people defending the city, which is what most armies, or at least rule of thumb has been around for quite a long time, has said that you do need if you actually want to successfully assault a castle and be successful in a siege. And the only way you can actually weaken them is to damage the castle, but damaging the castle does not affect the field force, so you still have the issue of you're still going to have to fight them with an equal force at every single situation since you can't sabotage armies themselves. And when it comes to the castle, whether or not you can sabotage it is also RNG, so there's a very real chance that you could try to do it and you will likely fail. And on top of that, sabotaging causes you to lose men, so it would also cause you to have less men to attack or guard with against your enemy if both of you are max stacks at that period of time. And as a result, many of the features in the game like sabotage don't really feel as important. Raising a huge army, while it helps to some extent, it gets very limited once you reach a certain point as well, so you don't really have an incentive to do anything because nothing you do matters because you're just decently well enough ahead by the mid to late game that you just end up doing nothing at all and wishing the game would end, since by that point the amount of story you get is also a lot less. That and the way that the turn order works in the game is also rather questionable. I feel like it breaks the tempo of the game quite a bit because the way it works is that each turn is broken up into multiple phases, and for each phase you have to take an action for the phase and then end the phase. And the thing is that every time you end a phase, instead of it being like you take a turn then the AI takes its turn for each respective force, what the game is doing is that it's calculating this for every single phase. So you take an action in the first phase of the first turn, you end the phase, the game calculates all of the AI's actions for the phase, and then you move on to the next phase of the turn and so on and so forth. And what this does is that it makes the game feel very disjointed, because if you don't want to do anything for a phase, for example, or let's say you just want to pass a turn to earn money or something, it means that you need to push 6 buttons just to end the turn, and you need to wait quite a few seconds in between each phase as well. So one turn of doing nothing can take anywhere between 20 seconds to a minute, depending on how many AI actions are being taken in the background. So that is something that feels a little off. I think I prefer the way they did it in Sengoku runs, where you take your turn, then each AI in order takes their turn after, and in doing so they can kind of ensure that you can do all of your actions, then you can go do something else while waiting. It's kind of like, I mean, it feels weird to use this as an example, but it's like early Civilization 6 or earlier in Warhammer 3's life cycle, where the games were taking super long on AI turns. But at least, even though it took a very long time, this long time was at the end of your turn, so you could essentially end your turn, go do something else and come back. Rather than, in order to finish your turn, you need to have this wait time split into 3 different segments, during which you have to constantly wait instead. I don't know about others, but it actually gave me a lot more stress while playing the game, just because of the fact that I can't play it normally. I have to constantly click a button just to pass at something simple, and then wait quite a while, and then do something else, and then come back and constantly split my attention in this way that does not feel very good. The battle system itself is also nothing too special at this point in time. Essentially, you have 5 lanes on the map, and at the start of the battle, you just pick a formation. The formation doesn't affect anything other than where your units start on the map, so depending on whose turn comes first, you may get a chance to hit them before they hit you and stuff like that, and that's all it really does. That said, you don't know who would go first, since speed set isn't a thing in this game, so you're just gonna have to take the gamble whether or not they'll go faster than you every single time. Then once you're done picking your formation, the battle is just essentially you picking which units to put in each of the 3 slots, and then once the battle starts, you can send in an extra side force, which would then go around and flank and hit one unit that you want to, and then it just retreats all the way back to base. Like, they don't stay and hide at the side or something, ready to ambush the enemy the next chance they get. They just go like, no, okay, our job's done, time to go home. And then they return all the way back to base, at which point you can send them out from base again, and they begin a slow march per turn towards the enemy again. And the way the battle is won is that both sides will then start to hit each other with the different attack types that they have, until one side has a unit that reaches 0 morale, and once that happens, they retreat. So you can only really use up to 4 of your 6 units. The other remaining 2 or 3, depending on whether or not you send out a side unit, can then be used to swap in with the front units wherever necessary. So if you have a unit that's about to run out of morale, and they are not in direct contact with the enemy, you can retreat them and send out another force. So it becomes a battle where you're largely just juggling this. The only issue with this is that different generals don't really have anything too unique about them. Like, the battle system itself is largely a case of, yeah, you kind of do have traits that affect the battle, but it's more in the sense of you have a stat stick that hits a little harder. Everyone still does the same thing in the same way, and whether or not you win a battle, it's more dependent on the turn order rather than your own skill in the game. Cause let's say you're both 1 tile away from each other, like what you see here. The thing is, whoever goes first quite likely is at a disadvantage if you're this close, because if you go first, you can't really hit the guy, but this guy who goes second kind of has a chance to go twice in a row, because once the first turn is over, because there's no speed stat, the game just randomly rolls who goes next. So if they get a chance to go twice, even if you choose to stand still a tile in front of them, they can just march once in and then hit you, and the AI is very, very keenly aware of what the turn order is, even though you can't see it. So if the AI knows that the turn order is in their favor, they'll just do the cheap shot of moving forward and hitting you. Yeah, you could avoid this by staying at a distance and shooting them, but shooting does very little damage in this game, and the AI can still continue this advance towards you, camp and shoot you back while waiting for their chance to get the double turn to hit you, all while you are left in the horror and terror of wondering whether, if you move forward, whether or not you'll get that second turn. Unless you save scum, of course, in which case you would be able to, by the power of the Avolo, be able to tell whether or not you can hit the guy, and therefore you can do a lot of damage to him. Because really, when a unit size of 50 hits another unit size of 50 twice in a row, you can really deplete them by quite a bit, with the potential chance of forcing them almost to 0 morale by that point in time. So the turn order ends up being more important than your general's individual stat stick. Because generals don't have skills special to them, they are all just the same unit with the same movements. It's rather boring, And also, it really kind of devalues each of your individual generals, since, yeah, you kind of have very famous names, kind of famous generals and warriors, but they don't really get as much of an advantage, and they don't really feel as important as they ought to be on the battlefield. People like Shibata Katsuye, I think that's his name, as well as Uesugi Kenshin herself as well. Herself? Yeah, I guess technically in real life they don't really know her gender either, so I guess we could, yeah, she probably works. There's a conspiracy theory that they could have been a female. That's not relevant to this video itself, but their general gender is unknown compared to most of the other people of the era, so we'll just go with she, since it fits the game, it fits potentially with real life, but you don't get a feel of how powerful each of these famous individuals are, and if you're a fan of the era, it would probably be quite disappointing. And this is something that I feel that Sengoku Runs actually does a lot better. Like, you get a lot more of a flair and distinctness in the battle capabilities of each of these characters. For one thing, the game actually has different unit types, which the Sengokuhime actually does not. I feel like that's something I forgot to mention, but all characters all use the same unit type, which is just whatever it is. They don't tell you either. You just know that your unit is able to do kinda everything. You have a lance, spear, stab attack, you have a normal all-out charge attack, and you have a gun attack. So it is a very generic unit that seems to be a catch-all for just army in general, which I feel does not really match up with how militaries used to work, particularly in that era. And I feel like with something like Runs, you kind of have that more obviously with the different unit types, which represent the different ways you could use a unit. You had the Ashigarus, which are the peasants who are your tank, you had gunners, you had archers, and so on and so forth, which made a lot more sense in the way that warfare would have worked. And on top of that is the fact that the characters that you get, the unique ones, tend to be more iconic and have their own special ability or skill that would make them more useful and oppressive as compared to the nameless auto-generated generals. Like, for example, you had Uesugi Kenshin, whose aura was so terrifying that it was apparently able to reduce the actions of your opponents. Or Sanada Torin, who is the lead strategist of Takeda, who's also in the game and is able to swing the battle just due to the fact that he's able to reduce the opponent's advantage, or things like how he's one of the strongest strategists, being able to buff your party as well. Then you also had Roblox Man and his Strike Witches Ward, who were both basically the physical manifestations of the Tanegashima rifles, which were the rifles, or matchlock rifles rather, that were first introduced into Japan back during the Sengoku era. Like, stuff like this where the characters are, well, fictional, they are very obviously built in a way where they represent something and have a very specific unique niche, because, for example, for the two of them, because of the fact that they were rifle units, they would be less effective in a long battle, since they would only be able to fire a few number of times before they would not be able to take an action anymore. And the stuff like this will be represented in the game through their high power, but their inability to act more than like once or twice. And the stuff like this where, by virtue of the fact that you had more stats, you were able to give the characters more uniqueness in the way that they would play. And as a result, the characters don't feel like just a stat stick with an image attached to it, which they felt a lot like in Sengokuhime. But aside from that, there's also the fact that when it comes to bugs in the game, on the bright side, with this battle mode itself, there weren't too many bugs, thankfully enough. I think the only bug I actually came across, which was still quite fatal, was the one where your morale would spontaneously drop, and I don't know why. I think you can see it here as well. Yeah, I guess they might have just like tripped on a rock or something and just hurt their morale so hard that they just decided that they needed to go home and cry about it instead. Though that aside, I think the only other bugs that were actually frequently reported were one where apparently just sound effects don't play, which is a bit of a bother, might be a bit immersion breaking, but nothing too serious in comparison to potentially losing the battle, because like walking causes you to fall down and lose morale. And I think the other one that was relatively problematic was one where apparently the graphic of the castle from the siege segment of the game had a chance to appear on the battle segment and just block off the opponent's half of the screen, which would make figuring out where they were quite problematic, since you wouldn't be able to see past it. So if they were behind it, there's a chance you might just walk into them and get hit. But that is something you can easily resolve through just save and loading, which with the PlayStation 2 version was quite problematic, but we'll talk about it a little later as well. The one thing that this mode did that I did find kind of interesting that was not in Sengoku runs was the fact that they actually took into account weather in this. And that was something very interesting. I feel like when it comes to most more strategic Sengoku games, they would tend to do it because weather obviously plays a very important part. In this game, it's done very simply with just fine weather, fog, and rain, where fog just makes it harder for you to see past one tower ahead of you, so you might walk into the enemy without realizing it, and rain stops the use of matchlock rifles, which when you equip your soldiers with 2 matchlocks instead of 1 to give them more guns than people, they do more damage to the enemy, hitting them in melee with the 2 rifles, like probably just dual wielding them like some kind of roided out Rainbow Ninja or something. But suffice to say that the fact that they took stuff like this into account was just a little bit more interesting, I guess, than what they had in runs, where it's just that different terrain types in terms of like whether you're fighting on the plains or the castle would affect how much advantage one side or the other has. For this, it's more a case of, yeah, certain styles of fighting would not work as well, but it's more a case of, well, then you need to take into account how you would approach the field a bit more cautiously and stuff like that instead. Though lastly, when it comes to the adventure segments of the game, that's to say the visual novel-esque segments where you just watch a conversation as if you were in an RPG game, I decided to leave it to the last since it's kinda linked to the other two parts we've talked about till now. Surprisingly, for something that sounds like it should be the most basic thing to do, considering the fact that visual novels have been around for a very long time and this style of having conversations is very common in just normal RPGs as well, there were actually quite a lot of bugs to the point that it was kind of surprising that they actually managed to mess it up to this level. So before I talk about the bugs, I just want to talk a bit about some of the problems with it as well, because there were some very glaringly strange choices that also led to more bugs in it as well. So one of the things is the fact that when it comes to the cutscenes, at the start of the game they appear normally, but at some point you have to manually interact with cutscenes by going to the event button, which is at the bottom right of this window here. So the thing with this is that for some reason, sometimes in spite of the fact that the character is not in your faction yet, there's a chance that their cutscene will automatically trigger where normally it would have been triggered through this button instead. And when that happens, you get a cutscene essentially for a character who you may not at the time even know they exist yet. And on top of that, it would skip the first phase of your turn as well. I think I mentioned that bug. But apparently, this cutscenes, due to some inexplicable reason, in spite of the fact that they would actually take up a lot of cost to manually do, they have a chance of just randomly activating. And if they do, and they only typically happen for characters who are not in your faction, they would just skip your turn, which, like I mentioned before, can be quite fatal. The other thing is the fact that for some reason they decided to make it such that generals in this game, even the important generals, can be killed very early in the campaign. And what I mean by this is that, and I had this happen to me in my first playthrough, due to the bug where factions crisscross like this. What happened was that Takeda attacked a castle that was isolated of mine, and I attacked across. And I attacked back, and in the very first battle I had with them effectively, I managed to kill the leader of the faction instead as a result. Because once, like I mentioned before, if they have nowhere to go, they will just die in the castle instead. So what happened is that, in spite of the fact that it was the first battle I ever had with them, so the general himself died, and as a result, all the cutscenes that were supposed to build character between them and the leader of my faction kind of just never happened. Which, I get that it's kind of realistic and cool to have it be such that the generals are just as mortal as anyone else or these famous figures, but the fact that it would cause cutscenes in general to just be completely erased makes it feel like quite a big waste. Like, I went to check online and I actually had to play through multiple playthroughs to get it to work, but turns out that if I had not let that happen at the time, there was supposed to be 7 cutscenes that would have triggered between the leaders of the two factions to show the level of rivalry and respect they had for each other. But because of the fact that they died in the first battle, instead what happened was I got the very first cutscene, and then I got the very last cutscene, which was meant to trigger when the leader of the other faction dies. And for some reason, in spite of the fact that this was the first time they ever crossed paths in battle, aside from the pre-war cutscene before all of this, the leader of my faction was all depressed and going like, "Oh yeah, it was such a shame that all this had to happen to them." After all the battles we had together, it was such a shame to lose such a worthy rival. And their general, the great strategist who supported them all throughout, who foiled so many of our plans, they are gone too. This is truly such a shame for our generation. Or something like that is what they would say, except due to the fact that they never actually ended up fighting each other more than once. All of this doesn't really make any sense anymore, because they still talk as if they had a very long rivalry. So the chronology skip makes it feel a little immersion breaking there, and the fact that the scenes in the middle could get skipped like this was also quite unfortunate. Like, it feels like a very big waste to have so many scenes added in a game where the player could inadvertently, by a bug that was designed into the game, end up missing all of this content. Then there's also the fact that even if you did try to trigger the scenes, there's a very real chance that you might just get a bug and the scene just never triggers instead. For example, like, I actually had to play through, like I mentioned before, that I played the game through like more than 25 times, just resetting over and over to try to make things work. Part of the reason was due to this as well. Like, to keep resetting the game to try and force Takeda into a position where they would not accidentally die, so that I could actually watch the goddamn cutscene. And the thing is, yeah, I managed to successfully do it at some point, but the thing is, even when I did, the screen just fades to black, and then the scene does not play, and then you just don't get any of the scenes ever again as well for the next few scenes after that until the final scene. So apparently this is also something that didn't only happen to me, but to a lot of other people who played this game as well, where scenes just simply were not triggering all over the place, and for all the other factions as well. Thankfully, key scenes to progress the game do not get bugged like this, but everything in between that is supposed to help build character has a very real possibility to skip. Apparently this is so bad that for many of the other characters that you can recruit halfway, because you can recruit many other faction members who aren't the leaders to your faction. For example, I managed to hire this what the hell are you wearing in the fucking Three Kingdoms, Warring this big plot cow print fetish play, as well as this other weird kink here. Like, for characters like them, you kind of get one cutscene and that's about it. And it seems like supposedly the rest of the cutscenes that were supposed to trigger were all bugged for all of them for me. So effectively, I ended up in a situation where you only get one cutscene with each of these characters, and the worst part is you don't really get an introduction to any of these characters beforehand. So all of this is just, you are suddenly meeting a new character who you don't know. You get one interaction with them, and that's it for the rest of the game. So that's also very weird that this can happen. And the fact that they do not have interactions or introductions for all of these characters as well feels a little odd in my opinion, because you are basically going to war with all of these different big factions and famous fetish cow people, and you're not really getting much development of them. And then you just have a whole list of like very strange bugs that should not have been in the game. It feels like this is the kind of stuff that ought to have been caught in QC, but for some reason just never was. For example, you have stuff like the text just corrupting like this completely for some reason, and this was like in the first 5 cutscenes of the character who is the leader of the faction, so this was rather early in the game. I'm surprised it was never caught. You have weird stuff like this as well, where for some reason there's another character's art behind this character's art, and this is not contextual at all. It has nothing to do with the scene. It's just a bug where these character models just overlap for a character that isn't even supposed to be in the scene, making it look like some weird anti-R thing. You have strange issues of screen tear, which I did not get, but there were a lot of reports of. Things like where if a cutscene has so much text that the text spills over to the second page of the log, for some reason the second page onwards just can't be viewed even though it says it can be viewed. Stuff like, for example, the face of the characters being plastered on in a weird way when they're trying to change expressions. Because for those of you who do not know, depending on the game, sometimes when it comes to having different models where just the facial expression changes, what they are doing is that instead of redrawing the entire character model and swapping that in and out, what some games do is that they would change just the face alone, and they just like plaster another expression on top of the existing model's face, so on and so forth. Like in those like images, those memes where you have the sad cowboy with the face over his face and stuff like that. It kind of reminds me of that. you also have weird things that I did not get that a lot of other players were talking about, reporting that they had gotten. You also had a possibility, reportedly, to have the character models just completely swapped as well. So the people who are having the conversation would have their models, the 2D ones, completely swapped with another character. I can't find the image anymore cause the links to those images are all dead since they were all uploaded apparently in 2010, and the website that they were on has been taken down. But supposedly that was a thing that happened. The links are still up on the website of the ranking itself, some of it at least, if you want to go and give those links a check and want to try to see if you can get them to work. And there was also, and this one I don't think it's a bug, it's more like an oversight, but it's actually possible for characters who are dead to appear in a cutscene, and I think this is more due to them just by virtue of the fact that system-wise you can have a character who will die, but who is kind of also core to the story as well, be a thing. Like you have characters who are important to, like let's say your faction leader's assistant or best friend, for example. They can die and you won't game over. I mean, your faction leader dying would most of the time cause the game over. Sometimes it wouldn't cause the game would bug and you can carry on the game in spite of the fact that everyone is dead. But aside from that, the game would typically be able to continue even though the people around the leader is dead. But those people would still appear in cutscenes due to the fact that they're kind of core to the story as well. So I feel like that's just an oversight with the way the game was designed, and that it would have been not fixed either way. Even if they did, it would be kind of weird since it feels like continuity would be an issue if some of these important people were missing, but apparently that is a thing that can happen. So you have stuff like body swaps, people getting their face ripped off and teleported elsewhere, complete distortions, sounds that the human body can't comprehend, the fact that dead are coming back to life as well. So you're starting to see what I mean more and more when I say that, like, bit by bit, this game over time becomes more and more horrific as you progress more into it, as the implications are that this world truly is the secret Japanese Warring States Eldritch Game of the Year. Though that said, there was actually another big issue with the game itself with regards to the adventure segments, which is the fact that because certain scenes could not be put onto a family-friendly version of the game, those had to be removed. So obviously there's less content, and because some of those scenes also involve the character development arcs, this means that you're getting a lot less character development as well. So what the company actually did was that for these versions of the game, they actually contracted the writer to write more story segments for each of the different factions. Problem is that the writer apparently half-assed it quite badly, to the point that the author came out like a few years later on Twitter as well, saying that for some of the routes he did not like the characters as much, and therefore he just chose to write less story arcs in for them. Like I think Nobunaga had quite a few added story arcs in, a little bit of new images here and there. For Uesugi, you kinda had the story arcs added in here and there, although they recycled cutscene images for the CGs. Meanwhile, for Date Masamune, apparently, there was just next to nothing added, so the character got super boring because you only got the originally saved scenes, and aside from that, maybe like one or two token scenes added which were very boring and that did not do the character justice, is what I heard. So that covers most of the issues I had with the individual segments of the game in terms of the bugs, as well as my issues with the systems themselves. And like I mentioned before, quite a few of these bugs, you can kind of get around them through save scumming quite excessively. The only issue with that is that for some reason the game kind of bugs out when it comes to saving as well. And there's a possibility that it would just not read your memory card. For those of you who do not know what a memory card is, it's something like this. So the way a memory card works is that you take your PS2, I have mine here, it's very dusty, and you would see that in the front here you have something like a flap. And what you want to do is that you want to take this thing and you want to like... you like that, don't you? But yeah, for older consoles you had memory sticks like this, which you could save your data in, and then it'll be a portable thing you can just take out and bring along with you. Stick into another PS2 and you can play your game on another PS2 as well. Very convenient stuff. I don't know why like some of the more recent consoles didn't have it, like the PS3. But this is just old man ranting. I mean, I'm not old, but that aside, thankfully the issue with the memory card does not actually cause it to corrupt. It's more like, it's not even an issue with the hardware itself. Like there's just something wrong with the CD or the game itself where just periodically it just decides that, yeah, you know, today I don't really feel like I'm up to it, so I'm not gonna read your memory stick. Try again later. And if you try again later, it works. And this is in spite of the fact that I also played the game on an emulator and I still got the issue on an emulator. So it's like, even on a system where theoretically there is no memory card that could get corrupted, where the game is supposed to read there always being a memory card, it just didn't for some reason. And I guess this might have been an issue with the porting as well, since this feels like a very PS2, PSP specific issue, and it actually makes save and loading in-game very slow. Like the save and load process itself is already slow, and for some reason the screen just sometimes just like shakes a little whenever you're trying to like save or load, and there's no real explanation for that either. The game just gives you a mini earthquake to like shake your consciousness back into reality to remind you that you are indeed playing through a eldritch horror of a game. Though yeah, the save and load itself can take anywhere between 5 seconds to 45 seconds, so that's also very slow. And considering the fact that with this, how buggy this game is, you kind of do want to save between each phase of every turn. That's a lot of time that can be burned if you actually want to try to clear this on a proper console. Thankfully, if you're using an emulator, you can just save state it, and that helps a lot, because with the amount of save and loading you need to do to evade the bugs, it's quite problematic. If you do not have your Diavolo level, like just snap your fingers and go back and erase time levels of skill, it's actually gonna be very painful to clear this game, because there are times that you could have like 10 battles straight, and like the game will bug on the 5th battle, and since each battle can take about like 30 seconds to a minute, that means that just reaching the 5th battle again would require you to play through the previous 4 battles, and the whole thing can feel like hell. So being able to save state is actually a very big blessing. Though that said, I do have a PS2 as well. I did play it once on the PS2, and that was why 7 times, I guess. But yeah, it's an issue that makes the game a lot less bearable when you're playing on the console. So if you're ever gonna do this, I don't recommend doing it on the console. It's even more about torture than it ought to be. Then lastly, and this is not so much a bug, more so an issue with the system of the game being made a lot worse just due to the amount of bugs, is the fact that the game's win condition is not told to you. So every faction has a specific win condition which is not told to the player. You need to gain a specific set of territories to get a specific title, and then on top of that, this stat over here, this one that I have not mentioned till now, this is called the I guess glory stat. It's like your clan's level of honor and respect that commands. So the thing is, and the game does not mention this to you, you either need to have 20 in that stat and 12 million in the city scale stat, which in the game will be represented as 1200 on that stat because it's at the 10,000th denominator. So in order to do that, it would take a lot of time and a lot of grinding and a lot of RNG. So getting to 20 in the honor stat is actually kind of difficult. And the good thing is that the game actually allows you to cover for that stat, in the sense that for every one less you have in that, if you have an additional 1 million in the other city scale stat, it kind of covers it. So if you had 19 and 13 million instead, you still could win the game, thankfully. Trying to get that stat is very problematic because it's really just full RNG. There really is no skill involved in it. How it works is that every few turns, there's no predetermined amount of turns. It's also RNG that you could affect by save ending and loading. A person who represents the Emperor would come down and give people titles, and when you get the title, that number goes up by 1. The issue of that is getting the title is random, so there is no guarantee you'll even get one. And you can kinda increase the odds of getting it by reducing the number of factions left on the map. So essentially, if you kill everyone off, you have a higher chance to get it. But the problem is that even then you're not guaranteed to get it due to the fact that whether or not the event even triggers is random. So the whole thing is just a big gamble as to whether or not they will actually come. So you can only pray that they do and hope that they do, so that you can actually be safe from this suffering when the gods of the Emperor finally decide to give you their blessing. Because if they don't, there's actually a chance that the game might actually just automatically game over at turn 250, so you don't want that to happen. So obviously the easiest way and the best way you could affect it is to increase your city scale, right? Because that's the one thing you can affect. The only issue is, like I mentioned before, that stat has a chance to bug, and instead of it going up when you try to upgrade the area, it just goes down instead. And on top of that, whenever a random rebellion occurs, there's a chance that both your honor stat and that city scale stat have a chance to go down. When natural disasters happen randomly, that stat also has a chance to go down. So there's a lot of very random events that could happen that could also reduce the stat. And the issue with that is that Coupling that with the fact that the game is super buggy and things can happen at random, like the happiness of our area just suddenly dropping to zero, and that causing another rebellion, as well as the fact that you just trying to upgrade the building can cause it to go down as well, makes it very difficult to complete all this without constantly saves coming quite a bit. And yeah, that's what really makes it very hard to win the game. The fact that the win condition is not told to you and it's not really affected by whether or not you truly actually take over the lands, that is also not explained in the manual how you win the game. So as a result, if you were to play this for the first time, it's actually very difficult to figure out how to win the game unless you just happen to get there by chance, which is how most people probably did, since conquest of land is only semi-related to the whole thing in the end. But yeah, if you have a Stan, a TARDIS, or a DeLorean to travel back in time with, and you have enough willpower to play through the entirety of this game, I guess you could kind of still complete it within a rather long, maybe insufferable period of time. I really feel like I can see why this game actually ended up getting the rating that it did as the worst game of the year, because compared to other games in the list, this is probably the only game that was completely unplayable and this level of buggy. The biggest issue with it really is the fact as well that the company should have known better, because they have released the exact same game once already on not only another console but on the PC as well the year before, so none of these issues should have been popping up. And there was actually quite a big joke as well at the time, because the company's name has the word alpha in it, that people were saying they wish that the company kept that to just the company's name and not turn every single game that they made back into the alpha version of the game instead. Haha, that's a funny. Am I just old for thinking that's funny? Thankfully, they actually managed to improve the next few games, and I think the company in the end did get bought over by another company, as they found that this business was not all too sustainable, unfortunately. So I don't think we'll ever get another 8th game, which is quite unfortunate, since the latest installments of the series are really actually pretty fun. Stop! Why hello, it's me, your friendly neighborhood salaryman from the future. You can tell I'm from the future due to the fact that my voice is actually pre-recorded, hence why I sound so clear even though I'm wearing a mask. And I'm here today to tell you something very important, which is that this dope actually made a mistake. Apparently, the second game in the series also ended up on the list, although it did not get the first place of its year. And apparently that second game, even without the box, takes about 200 hours to complete according to Famitsu magazine. So oh shit, that's really bad, isn't it? That's actually way worse than this is, although that one didn't win the thing. If you're into the more strategic sort of games, and I think those actually tried to do something more different from this. I think you had like different chapters within the story, and like your actions in the previous chapters would affect how the world would turn out and stuff like that. Like they really made the later games a lot better, although this first one really just wasn't all too good. Even for the PC version, it was actually known to be relatively buggy on launch. It's just that they could easily fix it, but thankfully it wasn't on the level where it ended up on this list. But for some reason with the PS2 version, the compounding effect of the lackluster systems and the fact that content was removed and the fact that the game was super buggy was probably what caused it to have this extremely bad rating that it had in the end. But yeah, that brings me to the end of everything I wanted to share about this game. I think this video actually ended up being way longer than I wanted it to be again. Like, I wanted it to be like a very short one. I just talk about the bugs and like the backstory of the game and all that, and make it like under 29 minutes if possible. But I think looking at the amount of time I spent recording, I have like a few hours worth of recording here. I don't think that's gonna end up being a very short video. So if this video ends up being very long, I do apologize. I hope that it was entertaining and that you managed to see how weird or, well, terrifyingly buggy this game was and why it ended up being as bad as it was. Like, comparative to this game, the other games that released within this era that were on the list were all slightly more competent. I mean, one of the games was so bad that apparently like $4 million went to development for a game that sold less than 100,000 copies, and it instantly bankrupted the company upon its release. But even that game didn't apparently come close to being as bad as this game is, as in terms of, well, if you were to try to play the game itself. the backstory for it was a lot worse, but that game even then was still a bit more of a success than this was as a game. It's the level of bad that we are at with the worst game of 2009. If you want to give this game a try, I strongly recommend doing it on an emulator because, like I said before, if you're gonna do it, there's gonna be a lot of need to save and load, and the in-game save and load system itself is also buggy, so you might want an emulator to speed things up, since you can also speed up the game as well when it comes to that. In terms of performance, it does not affect the performance. I managed to replicate quite a few of the bugs that people said were in the game, so you would probably get quite a close experience to what the game was originally like at the time. Even with an emulator, that is not going to be much of an issue. That said, I do have quite a few copies of the game now here since I bought the 3. If you want a copy of the game, I guess let me know on Twitter. I'll send you a copy because I don't need 4 copies of this game. I'll probably keep the PC version because that one's actually playable and entertaining. But aside from that, I have like 4 copies of this game, 3 of the PlayStation version. So if you want it, just to try to play it and see how bad it is, I would say don't do it. But if you want it just for the collection purposes, I'd say sure, I'll send it to you for free. Just let me know on Twitter in the DMs and I'll send it out to you. But yeah, I don't think I would wish this game upon anyone other than those who would willingly wish to suffer as a connoisseur of the Mamma Mia filth of the games that exist out there in terms of all the bad games. I would not recommend using this as CIA torture due to the fact that this is probably more likely to break some kind of Geneva Convention than the actual torture they're using now. Though yeah, that brings me to the end of the video. Thank you all for watching till this point. The next video will probably be at the start of the month. I have a video already planned. And there's an event at the start of next month as well, so that will come out maybe in the middle or towards the end of May. Events that I'll probably be going to and making a video on. So if you're interested in those types of videos, those are coming again. I will probably want to make more of this kind of videos as well. So if there's anything, if you found it interesting, do let me know. If there's anything you feel I could change to improve it, also let me know. I'm still trying to think of like how best to shorten this, but if you find there's like a lot of information in there that does not need to be in, or I'm like stumbling over my words or repeating things a lot, do let me know and I'll try to change that as well. I'll also be doing videos on other topics a little, mostly still Japan related in terms of some topics I want to talk about that are generally not really talked about as much. Though most of this will be related to the game industry. So that might be a bit interesting as well. Hopefully when it comes out, I don't want to spoil it yet. Do feel free to subscribe. You might see those within the next few months once I get around to recording everything. Because this period has been a bit busy. My internet is actually down right now. I have like 2 weeks to edit the video while going to work as well. Like I'm looking at the clock now. It's like I can only hope my internet recovers at this point. Otherwise, all of this will be very awkward. But yeah, I'll be heading off now. So take care and bye-bye.